Okay, we're like a minute past 12. Should we get
Yeah, I think
underway?
everyone would appreciate that. Enough of this nonsense. All right.
Yeah. Okay, so everyone, thank you very much for coming back to this session. We have Mark Johnstone now, and he is going to be talking us through content formats and how to find the right content formats for your content pieces. So over to you, Mark.
Right, let's see if I can get this screen up properly. Right. So if I do that, wait, I need to do something to double tap.
You can double tap.
Oh, you went there.
If they want the slides and you a bit smaller, obviously it's your choice. You may want to see Mark just as big as the slides. Go for it.
Does the how to choose format? It's up. All right, cool. So I have no idea how long this talk is going to be. Hopefully it won't be too long, but I'm not historically great at sticking to time with these things. So if I eat into question time at the end, you can catch me on Twitter at ContentHubble or email me at info@ContentHubble. This is a new site. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But yes, if we eat into Q&A time, if you do have any questions, you can catch me there. So a quick bit of background. I kind of, years ago, I don't even know how many years ago now, about 9 or 10 years ago, I set up and established the creative team at Distilled. We made a bunch of creative content that you may have seen floating around at some point. By the time I left Distilled about 3 or 4 years ago, by the time I left, I looked back at all the content we'd made and realized that it made over 14,000 linking root domains. Since then, I've really been digging into the process, thinking about how we come up with ideas and how we choose the right idea and the right format for idea. And I've been running training courses for brands and agencies who want to come up with better content ideas. And in every course that I run, I always write down every question that I get asked. And one of the questions I get asked a lot is, how do you choose the right format? Usually we mean the right visual format for your ideas. So there are really 3 starting points. The idea itself might be based on a format, so you're already up and running. If not, you might need to go and find the format that might work, that you can borrow from, or you can design it from the ground up. You can design it from first principles. So I'll give you an example of each of them so you know what I'm talking about. We're working with a company that prints photo books like this. You can take your digital photos and turn them into physical photos or physical books or things you can put on your desk, etc. So when we're coming up with ideas for them, I looked at my trusty swipe file where I keep interesting campaigns that I've made and other people have made as a source of inspiration. And I noticed this piece that was actually a piece that we'd made previously about how many records does an iPod hold? And you click on this stack of records and it auto scrolls for about 25 seconds. And it's a ridiculously huge stack of records. So this piece wanted to answer, how many records does an iPod hold? And I saw this in my swipe file and I thought, you know what, that would make a lot of sense for photos, because this client turns digital this piece here turns digital music into physical music. And our client turns digital photos into physical photos. So what would the equivalent be for photos? It's not an iPod. So how many photos are? I did a little Google search, and there it is in the suggested search. How many photos are on Instagram? I did this search recently, way back in the day. The very top result was how many photos are uploaded to Instagram each day. So we decided to, and each year, etc. So we decided to make that, and we ended up creating this piece. And you can click on this, and it scrolls way up, and it goes past the Empire State Building, etc., etc. I'm going to come back to this and tell you a little bit more about it, but for now, that is an example of starting with a format. We already had a format in mind due to the nature of the idea. So if you don't start with a format, you might need to find one. We were working with a company called Fleximize who offer business loans, particularly for startups. So they wanted to appeal to businesses in the startup space. I did some research during the ideation, and I discovered this post in this article in the Telegraph about the PayPal mafia. And this is people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and the guys that were a part of PayPal who became extremely rich when they sold PayPal, and then they were kind of got involved in lots of other businesses. So I thought this was quite interesting, and I don't know a lot about the tech startup space. So I decided to speak to my friend Ron, friend and former colleague, and I was asking him, could we show a piece about who the PayPal mafia are? Would that be interesting? But Ron said, look, people know who they are, but the phrase itself has become a bit of a myth. Like, nobody really understands why they're called the PayPal mafia. So could you explore that? So we dug into a bit, and it seemed to come from this article in 2007 in Fortune magazine. And the reason they're called the mafia is because, like the mafia, they kind of control, or, you know, the metaphor analogy is that they are controlling all the different businesses in Silicon Valley. They are all interconnected themselves like a big family, and they have their fingers in all the different pies in Silicon Valley. So could we show, so we could go, we looked into it, we could get the data, we can go to Crunchbase, which is a great data source for tech startups and acquisitions, and seeing who's involved in different companies. You could see who's acquired them, invested in them, who's on the board, etc. So we found the data, and then I had a conversation with my colleague VK, Vladimir, but known as VK, and I asked him, what formats could we use for this? Like, I've got my own swipe file, and I'm good at coming up with ideas. VK about what formats we could use, but VK is really into data journalism. He's a data journalist himself, and he has this kind of wealth of knowledge of data journalist formats. So he has his own swipe file. This is actually a screenshot from it, and he came back with this piece. Now, it might look a little bit complicated initially, but this was actually the perfect suggestion. This was from the New York Times, and the piece shows the clubs that connect the World Cup. And they walk you through it to make it easier to understand. So here, if you click on Real Madrid, you can see that Real Madrid has Ronaldo, who plays for Portugal. They have Alonso and Ramos and Casillas, who play for Spain. They've got Modric for Croatia. So this shows the way that clubs and country and players are all interconnected. So this was really perfect for what we're trying to show. So I actually came up with the idea for this just before I left Distilled. So the team at Distilled, led by VK, kind of took the piece on, and they ended up creating this. They did a lovely job. So here you have all of the members of PayPal, and then in the middle, you've got all of the companies they're involved in. And you can see LinkedIn, Uber, Airbnb, Lyft, Eventbrite, YouTube, Yelp, Quora, Tumblr, Reddit, Facebook. Like, it's ridiculous. So, and again, this is a little bit hard to understand at first glance. So to cover that, we did a little bit of an interactive walkthrough so we can explain the different things. And here you can see the 3 people that are involved in Facebook, the 2 that are involved in Reddit. You've got 2 involved in Airbnb. You can see all of the companies that Elon's involved in and the people that are connected to those, etc. Okay, so that's an example of finding the format to fit your purposes. And then the last option is to design from first principles. So we're working in the startup space for a different client. I did some research on TechCrunch to see what people are talking about. I realized that one of the things they're talking about a lot was acquisitions. This is a screenshot from recently. Just Eat have acquired Grubhub, which is quite interesting. And there's just this is something they talk about all the time in the startup space, because startups essentially want to be acquired. They want to make money, or a lot of them do, and make a big exit, like the guys at PayPal did themselves. So we came up with an idea. I'm going to jump to the end of this story because it's easier to understand it if we work backwards a bit. But this is the piece, this is the way that we presented that information, which shows all of the companies that Apple and Amazon and Google had acquired at the time over a period of 15 years and how much they'd acquired them for. This one down the bottom right, the biggest one, is 19 billion for WhatsApp, which happened just around the time that we launched this piece. So, but we actually designed this one from the ground up. We didn't reference our swipe file to come up with it. It wasn't baked into the idea from the start. This bit can be a little trickier, but I'll kind of explain a little bit how you do that. So to design from the ground up, you have to map your data points to a piece of the visual that represents it. In the data viz world, this would be called mapping your data variables to your visual variables. And I'll walk you through that. So to do this, you literally take a piece of paper and write down the different pieces of data that you have and might want to show. So we have data on the company that got acquired, all the different startups that have been acquired, the company that acquired them. That was kind of the whole point. So Amazon, Apple, etc. We've got date of acquisition. We've got cost of acquisition. And we also had the industry that the acquired company was in, whether they were in mobile or a hardware company, software, maybe they were a social media site, etc. So here is, and now we need to map a visual variable, a certain element of the design to each of these data variables. And I'll show you how to do that. So time generally goes along the x-axis or along the horizontal. So the horizontal position of these bubbles equals time. It equals the date of acquisition. That was the first one. That was a really obvious place to start. And then every dot or bubble equals a company that was acquired. Now, I did actually think at one point of putting them all on the same line, but it would get really confusing. So it made sense to separate the companies that were acquired by the different tech giants vertically. So here you've got horizontal position is date of acquisition. The bubble, i.e. the shape of the mark, is the company that was acquired, and then vertical position, who the company was acquired by. Size equals the cost or the size of the acquisition. That kind of quite an intuitive one there. And then we actually weren't going to put the industry or sector in, but we decided we had that information. We thought it might create some more interesting stories. You could see the different strategies that these companies had. Were they investing in software or hardware or social media, etc.? And obviously, we didn't know the angles that we're going to catch. And we put this in, and one caveat was that as long as it didn't distract from you being able to extract the other information. And actually, it made it look a bit nicer too. So those are the 5 visual variables. And actually, those are kind of the 5 visual variables you use most of the time. Shape, position on the where it lies on the page, vertically and horizontally, what size it is, or length, say if it was a bar graph or something, and what color it is. And you can actually make pretty much most visualizations from these 5 visual variables. It takes a lot. I've kind of given you the cleaner version of it there. It can take a little bit of a while to figure this out, and this one did for us. But actually, I maybe needn't have bothered, because if my swipe file had been a bit larger, or if I consulted this thing, which is called the DataViz project, you can look it up online. They have examples of lots of different visualizations you could use. And if I'd scrolled a bit, I would have found that it already existed. If you click into that, it even shows you examples, and that looks pretty much like the thing we made. I hadn't seen previously anything that looked like the piece we made. I actually thought it was a sort of innovative piece of design, but actually it already existed, and I maybe could have saved myself a little bit of hard work. All right, once you have your starting point, you want to look out for challenges with it. What's not working, and then look to solve those things. So this was a piece. This piece actually originated from a conversation. You probably can't really take much from it just looking at it, but that's kind of part of the point. I'll get to that. I've frequently had conversations with people in the pub who talk about, or actually, when I go back home to Edinburgh, I live in London. When I go back home to Edinburgh, maybe early on, I would kind of mention how expensive London was, and people would be like, yeah, but your salary in London are so much higher that it totally compensates for that. And I'm like, really? Because I mean, rent in London is probably double the price of Edinburgh. Public transport is it's about 4 times the price of Edinburgh. Pretty sure my salary isn't 4 times yours. So I was always curious about, like, does the salaries in different places like London actually compensate for the increase in the price of living? Unfortunately, that data doesn't really exist to the level you'd need it to in Britain, but it does exist in America. So we're working with a career-focused college in America. We decided to do this piece. I wanted to show, the idea was to show that even though salaries in New York and California might be among the highest in each different occupation, if you take cost of living into account, then it's probably lower. So this was our first mock-up. And we've highlighted, so on the left is the salaries for different states. That's just the raw salary or the average salary. And then on the right, you have it adjusted for the cost of living in each state. But when we started to design this, we're just looking at it and we're thinking, it's a little hard to extract the information from this. If I was presented with something like this online, I think I'd probably leave. So if you want to solve this problem, the thing to do is go back to what is it you're trying to show and get very specific about that. So I would ask myself, what was the idea? What did I want to show? And then pay attention to the language used. So I wanted to show that even though New York and California might be top of the list in terms of raw salary, when you take the cost of living into consideration, they might end up the 6th or 8th best place to work. So it's subtle, and it took me a while to figure this out, but the clues were here. It wasn't about how much they earned. It was about the order. So this piece, the vertical position, is actually how much you earn, but actually all I really wanted to show was the order. So we changed it, and this is a screenshot of the original live piece. And here you can see that New York is where, for this particular occupation, you get the highest salary in New York. It's the second highest, but if you take cost of living, it actually becomes the 8th highest. So this was a much easier way to show this, and you can click on any of the states and it'll color code that state in both lists so you can see it. So it was quite subtle, but that became a lot easier to see the point than this one. In a similar exercise, we wanted to show how a colleague came to me with an idea about showing the evolution of mobile phones, and specifically, we wanted to show how the resolution of phone screens has got so much better. So, like, we wanted to show the kind of journey phones had gone on from this old Nokia you can see on the left. I don't know if you guys remember that. I remember everyone at high school having that phone. I might tell you a little bit. It was the final year of high school too, so I might tell you a little bit about how old I am. And it was amazing because you could change the color of the face. Incredible. We had no idea what was just about to come. Anyway, we wanted to show how much the screen resolution had improved from these old Nokias to the iPhone 7 Plus or 6 Plus, which had just come out in time. So I got a designer to mock up the amount of pixels in each of the best-selling phones over that time period. And this is what we got. And it's kind of like, I mean, when you look at it, it's not very exciting. It's also a bit abstract. Like, I know that the Nokia phone isn't as small as that screen up the top left. And I know the iPhone 7 isn't as big as that square. So somehow this doesn't really represent reality. It's not very relatable. So I asked myself again, what is it what's really going on here? What are we trying to show? And the answer to that is that for resolution to get better, pixels are getting much smaller. That's what makes the picture clearer. In fact, screens are also getting a little bit bigger, but that's actually largely irrelevant. The point is the pixels are getting smaller. So I kind of had this idea that, cool, well, maybe we could like sort of have a whole page that's like filled with pixels and we could zoom through it literally like the Matrix. I was probably getting a wee bit carried away here. I just really like the Matrix, but it did sort of lead to somewhere. But again, we were trying to just show pixels, and it's like, well, pixels aren't very relatable. So then we actually thought, what if we just compared it to the original Nokia screen and asked how many of these old Nokia screens could fit inside the new iPhone 6 Plus, which has the same resolution as the 7 Plus. So I can't hear you guys, but actually, how many do you think? You don't answer out loud, but you can stick it in the chat if you want. How many of these old Nokia screens do you think fit inside the iPhone 6 Plus or iPhone 7 Plus? We'll get to the answer in a second. Bear in mind that pixels are getting smaller, and I'll show you how that works. So this is the piece that we made. It was a kind of scrolling, animated, interactive. But I'll just take you through it in some screenshots. So we've got the old Nokia, and then the pixels shrink a bit and fit inside the new Motorola Razr, which has 9 Nokia screens inside of it. Then we've got the BlackBerry Pearl, which has 15 Nokia screens inside of it. And then pixels are getting smaller again. First gen iPhone, 38 Nokia screens. First gen Moto X, 228 Nokia screens. And then we reached the iPhone 6S Plus, 514 Nokia screens. If that's surprising to you at all, that's important. It's important that it's impactful and surprising, and also that we can relate to it, that it kind of translates into a reality. Unlike those abstract squares or just the pixels themselves, hopefully I've kind of shown you that this is much more relatable, it's impactful, and it's surprising. So if it had just been 50, we'd have been a bit blah. Actually, on that point, I told you that we kind of had the idea for this Instagram piece, which was based on this iPod piece. But initially, after coming up with that idea, I thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could show it stacked beside a building and show, if you printed off all the photos on Instagram, what would that look like stacked beside a building? If it was like a 3D volume like a building. Like they've done in this piece here, which shows these are meant to be $100 bills, all stacked in pallets to show the US debt in 2017, completely towering over the Statue of Liberty there. So I was like, well, if we did a kind of 3D version that was the same width as the Shard, if we printed off all those photos and stacked them 3D, how much tall would it be? Cool if it was like part of the London skyline and it was way above the Shard or way above the Empire State Building. So we did the calculations. If I had the same size of base as the Shard, how high do you think it would be? 23 meters. So pretty underwhelming. Don't think we could have gone out with that as a piece of content. So then we thought, well, what if we did it as an area? Yeah, if it was an area, I would cover this much of London. That's 14 kilometers by 14 kilometers. Technically, that is a huge area. You know, there was 20 billion photos, but it just felt a little bit underwhelming. So we ended up going with, well, what if we just stacked them one on top of the other? And this is the thing that's crazy, that if you put them in a cube, they would be 50 meters by 50 meters by 23 meters. But if you just stack them on top of each other, they reach over 6,000 kilometers. I still can't wrap my head around that. I've double, triple checked the maths. I've got 3 people to check it is right, but it is weird. So anyway, but we needed it to be impactful. So we ended up creating this piece where it zooms off into the sky and it passes the Empire State Building, it passes Everest, it passes the edge of the Earth's atmosphere, the International Space Station, and ends up way off into space, 6,300 kilometers high. Now that was surprising and impactful. So one question I always get in my workshops is, do they all need to be big budget? You know, I've shown you some kind of interactive pieces there, and yeah, but not everyone's working with these big budgets. So do they need to be big budget? So actually, after my first workshop, when someone asked that question, I got in touch with my former colleagues, Hannah and VK and Matt Round, and I emailed them. I said, can you guys think of some good low budget content I can share with people? And they shared a bunch of examples with me, and I'm going to share some of them with you shortly, but Matt Round, one of my colleagues, came back with a really interesting point that's always stuck with me. He said, nearly everything can be done on a low budget. Now, nearly everything. Some things I've done definitely couldn't, but he really has a point. And I want to show you. One example sprung to mind immediately. We once made this game called the Emergency Stop Test. You drive along in this car, and it's like the old emergency stop test in your driving test. A hand will come up, and you have to react, and it shows how quick your reaction times are. It compares you to other people. It guesses your age and stuff like that. It's a very successful piece of content. But I kind of briefed the production team, and I took my eye off it for a couple of weeks. I was working on other things, and I came back. The designer and the developer had absolutely gone to town. You know, it's got these 3D trees. It actually kind of goes up and down over little hills. There's deer in there. Like, I actually noticed as well that the speedometer moves. Like, there's all this stuff. I mean, they had a great time, but that was really not what I intended. I'd actually intended it to look like a super old school video game. I may actually just be revealing my age. They probably don't remember video games that looked like this. But I just meant like super static, and maybe just the white line move to pretend that you were getting some kind of motion, and then you react. So that could have been so much cheaper. And then I also get the question, do they need to be interactive? I recently, for another talk I did a couple of weeks ago at Outreach Conference, I interviewed 9 content creatives from 5 different agencies about lots of campaigns. It was about 5 campaigns each that they'd been involved in that had got lots of links. And one of the interesting things, I'll tell you at the end how you can get more information about the stuff that I spoke to these guys about, but one of the interesting things was that actually quite a few of them were static. This is just a sample of the static ones. Era did this piece that was based on a survey about how would you modernize Santa that did really well, and that's the execution there. Neomam did this piece about the oldest company in almost every country in the world. That's static. And then Rise at 7 did this kind of fake product, Christmas dinner in a can. None of this is interactive. I know that the oldest company in the world did take a lot of data and research. So there was a bit of cost in that, but interesting to know that the executions actually don't have to be interactive. And again, taking Matt's advice, rather than just looking at, one thing I'm worried about when people ask, oh, do they need to be expensive? Do they need to be interactive? Sometimes it's just a genuine question, but sometimes I feel like people are just looking for reasons that they can't do things. They're looking for excuses. Like I've heard some ridiculous excuses before, like people say to me, oh, that's okay for you because you and your team have loads of relationships with journalists. We don't. I've literally spoken to 1 journalist in my life. Actually 3, but 2 of them were just at parties. We don't have a little black book we can call on because we're in loads of different agencies, so it's not true. I even heard somebody, a client, after we made a really successful piece, went, oh yeah, but that's so easy for you because you just need to tweet it from a Distilled social account and it'll go viral. Totally not true. So like I am wary about, like, don't fall into the trap of looking for excuses. What to do instead is a bit like I was saying earlier, identify a challenge and then flip it into a question and solve it. That's what creative people do a lot of the time. So if you don't want to make interactive things, or if you don't want to make big budget things, look for things that look like big budget and challenge yourself, how could this have been done on a lower budget? Same with interactive. How could this have been static? So this was a piece we did about the vocal ranges of famous singers. And the interactivity in this is minimal. Like you can, if you hover over the bar there, I'm hovering over Mariah Carey, it tells me which songs she hit the lowest note and the highest note that she's ever hit in the studio. Now that is useful information and it probably couldn't have fitted in that graph quite nicely. And yeah, it highlights the notes on the piano, which is a nice touch, but definitely not essential. And actually, this bar graph could have been static. And then if I really wanted, I could have created a table of the information that's available on Hover and put that underneath the graph. And therefore, the whole thing could have been static. So it's interesting to challenge yourself. You know, it's really important to build a swipe file. Go and build a swipe file of content that isn't high budget, that isn't interactive, but also look at stuff that is and challenge yourself to think, how could this have been cheaper? How could this have been static? And if you're not going to do interactives, I actually think GIFs are a little bit underrated. These are 3 GIF infographics that the guys at Area have done, which I think are pretty cool. The one on the left shows robots taking over jobs. The one in the middle shows what happens if you remove all the male seats from the boardroom tables at the top 10 companies in the world. And this one on the right is about space junk and all the junk that's floating, orbiting the Earth. And it's just a GIF infographic and the world spinning. It's a nice little touch. And like a GIF takes a designer like an extra half hour or something. So it has a nice little bit of aesthetic appeal for a low investment. So you could consider that. Or if you want to play a little bit in the interactive space, think about minimally interactive graphics. The guys at Digital Loft did this piece that went viral about you versus the Kardashians. You put in your salary. I've put in a salary of 25,000 there. And it tells you that Kim could earn that in 5 hours and 47 minutes. And then it tells you how quickly her sisters could have earned that as well. But a tiny bit of interaction there. That wouldn't have cost a lot to build. Similarly, the iPod graphic. The only interaction here is you click on that arrow and it auto scrolls for about 25 seconds and this huge stack of records whizzes past. That took 3 or 4 hours to build. So like sometimes the small amount of interactivity can have a large perceived value and you could start to play in that space too. Doesn't need to have data. No, but it helps. Data equals facts and journalists report on facts. If it doesn't have facts in it, then it's opinions. So actually, the majority of the stuff you'll see in our industry does have data in it. However, there are some formats that are non-data. If you really are opposed to data, you could do the whole dream jobs thing, which has been going around. You could do fake products. This was a piece that it's a cologne with the new car smell, which got some links and shares. You could do a kind of photo project. This was a piece where the company asked people around the world to adjust this lady's body shape to make her more to fit with their culture's perceptions of beauty. So some people would argue that is data, but I think for you and I, we mean a spreadsheet, right? So this wasn't based on a spreadsheet. And then I was going to include this piece, which was, what would Barbie look like in real life? It's actually done by a rehab company, which I thought was quite an interesting piece of content about, people being obsessed with kind of Barbie figures and actually how it's unhealthy. But actually, I was going to say this isn't based on data, but technically it is. It's measured the dimensions of Barbie and then compared them to the average person and also figured out what would happen if a real person had the same dimensions as Barbie. But it doesn't really look like data. And actually, it's got some interesting stats, like with a neck this size, she actually wouldn't be able to lift her head. But it does have data behind it, but it doesn't look like it, right? And I've definitely been guilty of, what's the old adage, if all you've got is a hammer, everything's a nail. I have used data visualization for everything. Perfect, that's the buzzer at the door. If I have used data visualization in the past for everything, I've got a little bit guilty of that. We did a piece for a fashion brand about the most mentioned brands in hip hop, and then we created these graphs. But honestly, go and look at fashion websites. They are not filled with graphs. They are filled with photos. Photos of celebrities, photos of designers, and photos of clothes. So choosing a graph was a bad choice. I would have been better doing something like this. This was a piece by the guys at Verve that did really well. And it's about the most valuable sneakers in the world. And there's actually a lot of data in here. You can click into it and you can find out how much these trainers were sold for, how much they cost originally, their appreciation value, I think maybe even how it compared to the stock exchange over that time. But it doesn't look like data, right? It looks like something that you would find on a fashion website. They've done a really beautiful job there. So I definitely could have learned from that back in the day when I made that graph for fashion. And ultimately, even there's a danger of thinking of formats in isolation. And I've seen people get this wrong countless times. It's still the idea that counts. I'll give you an example. I don't think anyone did this, but imagine if you'd seen this piece about what would Barbie look like in real life and decide, well, what would Buzz Lightyear look like in real life? It's totally missing the point, right? The Barbie piece is about these kind of false impressions and unattainable beauty that the perceptions that we are giving to young girls from an early age. The Buzz Lightyear one would be completely irrelevant. And I've seen this done a lot of times. I just don't want to call people out publicly. You remember this photos of Instagram piece? Well, somebody copied this and they're spoken about publicly, but I'm not going to mention them by name. So they went and did what would happen if you printed off all the emails in the world. It didn't work. It totally missed the point because at the time that we did this, which was quite a long time ago now, Instagram was just taking off. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone was wondering how many people are on here? How big is it? So they were curious about it. It was a hot topic. And it made sense. You would print off photos. We used to print off photos. Who on earth would print off all their old emails? Who's surprised that there's a lot of emails? It kind of totally missed the point. So be careful of thinking of formats in isolation. The idea is still key. So let me recap. This has been pretty fast. I'm not sure if I've breathed during this, but okay, I'll take a breath. Okay, how do you choose the right format? There are 3 starting points. The idea is based on a format. You go out and find a format using a swipe file, or you design from first principles. Identify challenges with the format. Think very specifically. Pay attention to the language you use in describing the idea, and think literally, what is it that we want to show, and then make sure you're showing that. Similarly, you want to make sure that it's impactful, and also that it's concrete and relatable, that it's not abstract and weird like this grid of squares on the left, that it's something people can easily understand, like the piece on the right. It doesn't need to be a big budget. It doesn't need to be interactive. There are some non-interactive formats you can actually, and it doesn't need to be driven by data. There are some non-data driven formats, but the data-driven ones are good. But that said, they don't need to look like data. And remember, above all, like the idea is kind of still everything. So how do you come up with ideas? Where I'm not about to launch into that now. But conveniently, I have launched a site which is all about that. It's just a soft launch at the moment. But remember, I told you that, you know, I spoke to these 9 content creators about if you stick my campaigns in amongst the ones I spoke to them about, you've got 31 campaigns from 6 agencies. They've got 11,000 link and root domains. I'm compiling this all into an ebook, which will be launched next week. And I'll tell you exactly how they came up with the ideas step by step so you can borrow from their processes and create your own successful campaigns. So if you want to get that, go over to Content Hubble, sign up, and I will send that to you next week. All right, I am done. Questions? How are we doing for time?
You are okay. We have 3 minutes and we do have a question. First of all, that was awesome. I can't wait to see Content Hubble and the ebook. The question we have, is there a piece that you've made in the past which, with the benefit of hindsight, you'd now execute using an alternative format?
Oh, yes, loads. But actually, I'll give you a really good one. Let me see if I can do this quick. I'll find it on my... Not a lot of people have seen this piece, actually, kind of partially because of this reason. I'm embarrassed to say I completely overcooked it. It's about food, so that's a really terrible pun. But let me see if I can show this quickly. We'll go into that weird tunnel view in a second. Right, can you see this? The top 50 foodie capitals of the world?
Yes.
Okay, this piece, we analyzed all of the restaurant review data in every city in the world with over 500,000 people living there to find out how many different types of international cuisine they had, like Italian, Chinese, Ethiopian, etc. Turns out New York has the most with 94 different national cuisines. London has 89, and then there's Toronto with 73, Chicago, Paris, etc. But the information itself was really the value we were bringing. So the execution is just way over the top. I would argue, I bet you don't even instantly understand what's going on here. But the important bit is just the list. And this piece maybe could have been a list or a much simpler execution. I mean, you can click in and see all of the top restaurant for every type of cuisine around London. I even did this one, which no one understands, but I thought was clever, where this is how you can travel around the world by eating in restaurants in London. It's really counterintuitive. So that restaurant is not in Bolivia, it's in London. Nobody got that. I'm not even sure anyone clicked on it. So like ridiculous over execution. It probably could have been a list, and I would really like to know how well it would have done if it was a list. I bet it would have done well. So just like the execution was on, if you're bringing new information, then the execution doesn't need to be that over the top. But if the information already exists, see like the screen resolution, then it is all about the execution. But you don't necessarily need to do both. If the information is new, the execution can be a lot simpler. So I think that worked despite the execution, not because of it. So that's my answer to that one.
Answer. Time. So thank you so much for the presentation. Everyone make sure you go and sign up to Content Hubble. We will now have a break for lunch for an hour. So go get some lovely food. And then I will be back with my presentation at 1:40. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome, thanks.